The light pink prairie dress was a foolish thing to wear in Harmony Creek, Nevada. And Lee knew this. The fine cotton, meant for a gentler world, drank the ochre dust that rose from the main street with every passing horse and freight wagon. It was a constant, thirsty battle to keep it clean, a battle she fought every night with lye soap and a bucket of well water. But the dress was also a statement. It was the last gift from her father before he passed, a whisper of a life she was determined not to forget, even here, in the sun-baked heart of the territory in the summer of 1878. Every morning before the sun had a chance to burn the mercy from the air, Lee would set up her small wooden table at the edge of the open-air market. Upon it, she would arrange her wares, each loaf of bread covered by a clean, thin cloth. Her sourdough was tangy and possessed a chewy crust that men swore by. Her milk bread was soft as a prayer, bought by mothers for their children. She worked from a small rented room with a temperamental oven behind the blacksmith shop, and every cent she earned went toward her keep, with a few pennies saved in a loose floorboard. She was a solitary figure, quiet and diligent, a splash of soft pink in a world of brown canvas and weathered denim. The townspeople were not unkind, but they were not familiar, either. They bought her bread because it was the best for 50 miles, but their conversation was reserved for their own. And Lee existed in a pocket of polite, commercial silence. Then, he started coming. His name, she learned from the whispers of the market women, was Arthur Vance. He was not a cowboy in the way of the dusty, loud young men who drove cattle through town. He owned the vast tracts of land that bordered the creek, the kind of man whose wealth was quiet but as deep and certain as the water table. He rode a handsome bay gelding with a saddle that sported subtle silver conchos, and he never raised his voice. The first time he stopped at her table, the market seemed to hold its breath. He was tall, and the shadow he cast fell over her entire display. He did not look at her directly at first, his gaze fixed on the loaves. His face was weathered by the sun, but his eyes were a clear, steady gray. "Sourdough," he said. His voice was low and carried no hint of hurry. Lee nodded, her hands moving to wrap a loaf in a small sheet of brown paper. She stated the price, her own voice barely a murmur. He placed a silver coin in her palm, the metal cool against her skin. It was more than the price of the bread. "Keep it," he said, before she could find the words to object. He tipped his hat, a gesture so crisp and formal it felt out of place in the dusty market, and walked away. He came back the next day. And the day after that. Every morning, just as the sun cleared the eastern hills, Arthur Vance would ride into town, tie his horse to the rail in front of the telegraph office, and walk directly to her table. He always bought one loaf of sourdough. He always paid with a coin that was too large, and he always told her to keep the difference. He never tried to make small talk, and after the first week, he began to meet her eyes when he spoke. In his gaze, she saw no pity, no condescension. She saw a quiet sort of appraisal, a steady regard that was more unsettling than any insult. It became a ritual, a fixed point in her precarious existence. The other vendors began to watch, their curiosity a palpable thing. The blacksmith's wife, a portly woman named Martha, finally broke the silence one afternoon. "Mr. Vance seems to have taken a liking to your bread, dear," she said, her tone a mix of suspicion and grudging respect. Lee merely nodded, offering a small, non-committal smile. She did not know what to make of it. The extra money was a blessing, allowing her to buy better flour and even a small sack of sugar, but the attention was a weight. In a town like Harmony Creek, a woman like her survived by being invisible. Arthur Vance was making her scene. One sweltering July morning, the tension that had been simmering under the town's surface finally boiled over. A man named Jedediah Croft, who owned the general store and held the mortgage on half the buildings in town, strode into the market. He was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own pronouncements, his belly straining the buttons of his waistcoat. He stopped in front of Anneli's table, his shadow darker and more menacing than Arthur's had ever been. "This spot is for proper town merchants," Croft declared, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not for transients." Lee felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She kept her eyes on her hands, which she folded neatly on the tabletop. "I pay the market fee, Mr. Croft." The fee gives you a space, not a guarantee, he sneered. This market is becoming cluttered. It's bad for business. My business, he gestured vaguely at her loaves. Besides, who knows where this is even made? Could be unsanitary. A murmur went through the small crowd. It was a baseless accusation, but mud, once thrown, had a way of sticking. Anelli's chin lifted. My kitchen is clean, sir. Cleaner than your storeroom, I imagine. The words were out before she could stop them. They were quiet, but they carried. Croft's face purpled with rage. He took a step forward, his hand raised as if to sweep her goods to the ground. Why, you little? Is there a problem here, Jedediah? The voice was calm, cutting through the thick, angry air. Arthur Vance stood just behind Croft. He hadn't ridden in, he must have been at the assayer's office. He held no weapon, but his presence alone seemed to change the very atmosphere. He had taken off his riding gloves, and his hands hung loose and relaxed at his sides. Croft spun around, his bluster deflating slightly. Arthur. Just a matter of town business. Tidying up the market. It looks to me, Arthur said, his grey eyes moving from Croft to Lee, like you're harassing a business owner. He stepped past Croft and stood before her table. His gaze was soft as he looked at her. I'll take the sourdough, as usual. In fact, he added, his voice rising just enough to carry, I'll take it all. Everything you have. I'm having some men up to the ranch to help with branding. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather purse. He didn't count out coins. He dropped the entire purse onto the table. It landed with a heavy, final thud. It was more money than Lee had seen in a year. Croft's jaw worked silently. He was a man who understood the language of money better than any other, and the message was clear. Arthur Vance had drawn a line in the dust around the baker and her table. To cross it would be to cross him. Without another word, Croft turned and stalked back toward his store. The crowd dispersed, whispering among themselves. Lee stared at the purse, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up at Arthur, her mind a whirlwind of gratitude and fear. He had saved her, but he had also chained her to him with a public act of patronage she could never repay. Thank you, she managed, her voice tight. A man ought to be able to conduct his business in peace, he said simply. He gestured to the bread. I wasn't lying. I do have men coming. Could you have this delivered to the livery? My foreman will pick it up. Of course, she began to gather the loaves, her hands trembling slightly. She pushed the purse back toward him. This is too much. It's what they're worth, he said. His eyes held hers for a long moment. And for the trouble. Before she could protest again, he gave her that same formal tip of his hat and walked away, his long strides eating up the dusty ground. Lee watched him go, the heavy purse a brand on her table. The silence he left behind was different now. It was no longer just polite. It was charged with questions she had no answers for. She did not yet know that Croft's humiliation was a seed that would sprout into a more dangerous kind of trouble. The incident with Jedediah Croft changed things. The overt hostility in the market vanished, replaced by a wary curiosity. People still bought her bread, but now their eyes held a new light, a speculation that made Anelli's skin prickle. She was no longer just the Chinese baker, she was Arthur Vance's baker. The title felt like a borrowed coat, one that didn't quite fit and could be taken away at any moment. Arthur continued his daily ritual, but now a subtle shift occurred. He would linger for a moment after buying his loaf, his grey eyes scanning the street as if checking for threats. Sometimes he would ask a simple question. Did you have a good morning, or the heat doesn't trouble you? His questions were never invasive, but they were personal. They were admissions that he saw her as more than a vendor. Lee answered in quiet, brief sentences, her natural reserve warring with a growing sense of gratitude. She found herself watching for the sight of his bay gelding, the rhythm of her morning now tied to his arrival. One afternoon, a week after the confrontation, he approached her as she was packing up her unsold loaves. The market was nearly empty, the long shadows of late day stretching across the dirt. "Miss Lee," he began, using her name for the first time. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that felt profound. "May I have a word?" She straightened up, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Mr. Vance, I would consider it a kindness if you would walk with me," he said, gesturing toward the quieter end of the street, away from the saloon and the general store. Hesitantly, she fell into step beside him. He walked slowly, matching his long stride to her smaller one. For a time, they walked in silence, the only sounds the scuff of their boots and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. "Mr. Croft will not trouble you again in that manner," Arthur said finally, his gaze directed forward. "I've had a word with the territorial clerk about the market charter. Your spot is secure." "You did that for me?" she asked, her voice soft with surprise. "I did it because it was the right thing to do," he corrected gently. He stopped near the town's lone cottonwood tree, turning to face her. The setting sun caught in his hair, turning the brown strands to bronze. "But that's not what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to apologize." And Lee frowned in confusion. "Apologize? For what?" "For the attention I've brought you. For making your life more complicated. I saw you were being treated unfairly, and I acted. But I did not consider how my actions would look to others, how they would mark you." It was an astonishing admission. In her experience, men like Arthur Vance never considered the consequences of their actions on people like her. They moved through the world with an assumption of rightness. His awareness of her predicament, of the delicate social space she occupied, was a revelation. "You protected me, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "There is no need for an apology." A small smile touched his lips. "All the same, I wanted you to know that my intention was not to claim you, like one of my cattle." He paused, and a flicker of something vulnerable crossed his face. "The truth is, your bread, it reminds me of my mother's. She passed when I was a boy. She had a way of making something good out of almost nothing. It was her gift." He looked at Lee, his eyes direct and honest. "You have that same gift. Seeing you here every morning, working so hard, with such dignity, it's the most decent thing I've seen in this town in a long time." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just a customer. He wasn't just a patron. He saw her. He saw the skill, the labor, the history baked into every loaf. Something tight and guarded in her chest for years began to loosen. For the first time since coming to Harmony Creek, she felt like more than a curiosity. She felt understood. "My father," she heard herself say, the words coming out in a rush, "he loved the sweet milk bread. He said it tasted like kindness." She clutched the worn fabric of her apron, the familiar texture a comfort. It was a simple, coarse-spun thing, but it was a symbol of her trade, of her independence. Arthur's gaze dropped to her hands clutching the cloth. He didn't speak, but the understanding in his eyes was answer enough. The space between them was no longer that of a rich rancher and a poor baker. It was something quieter, more fragile, and infinitely more real. But Jedediah Croft was not a man to accept public defeat. Humiliated in the market, he sought a different avenue of attack. He couldn't use force, not against a woman under Arthur Vance's clear protection. So he turned to the law, or his twisted version of it. He spent days poring over land deeds and town ordinances in the clerk's office, searching for a lever. And he found one. The small room Lee rented, the one with the precious oven, was part of the blacksmith's property. The blacksmith, a decent man named Peterson, owned his shop and the small lot it stood on. But the deed was old, from the town's founding, and the property lines were described in relation to landmarks that no longer existed. Croft, who owned the adjacent parcel, hired a surveyor from Carson City. The surveyor arrived on the morning train, a fussy little man with a tripod and measuring chains. By midday, he had driven a new stake into the ground. The stake was planted 3 feet inside the wall of Anelli's small kitchen. According to the new survey, commissioned and paid for by Croft, her oven, the heart of her entire livelihood, was on his land. Peterson, the blacksmith, was furious but helpless. "It's a sham, and Lee, a pure sham. That line has been the same for 20 years, he fumed. But Croft had a piece of paper, signed and sealed by a licensed surveyor. He had a legal claim. That evening, Croft delivered the notice himself. He didn't deign to speak to Lee. He handed the document to Peterson, who then had to bring it to her. The paper gave her 48 hours to cease use of and remove all personal property from the encroaching structure, remove her oven. It was made of brick and clay, built into the very wall of the room. It was impossible. He was evicting her from her life. She stood in her small room, the notice trembling in her hand. The courage she had felt while talking to Arthur evaporated, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. She had been a fool to feel safe. Here, on the frontier, a piece of paper in the right hands was more dangerous than any gun. Her brief summer of hope was over. She could leave town, start again somewhere else, a ghost in another dusty street. It would be the sensible thing to do. But then she thought of Arthur's words. "The most decent thing I've seen in this town," she thought of the respect in his eyes. Leaving felt like a betrayal, not of him, but of the person he saw in her. A stubborn spark ignited in the cold dread. She had built this life with her own 2 hands. She would not let a man like Croft take it with a lie on a piece of paper. The choice was a costly one. To stay and fight meant facing Croft's wealth and influence, a fight she could not win alone. It meant relying on Arthur Vance, deepening a debt she already felt was insurmountable. But to run was to lose herself. She folded the notice, her resolve hardening like the crust on her sourdough. She would stay. The next morning, she was at her table as usual, but she had only a few loaves to sell, baked before the notice had arrived. When Arthur rode up, he saw the tension in her face immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't speak. She simply unfolded the surveyor's notice and handed it to him. He read it, his face impassive, but she saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and handed it back. "He can't do this," Arthur said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "He has a paper that says he can," Lee replied, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Mr. Peterson says the old deeds are unclear. It would take a court in the territorial capital to sort it out." By then, she didn't need to finish. By then, she would be long gone. Arthur was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed on some distant point over her shoulder. He was calculating, weighing options. She could see the wheels turning. Finally, he looked at her, his expression resolute. "You will not be moving your oven," he said. "And you will not be leaving Harmony Creek. Go back to your kitchen after the market. Keep baking. I will handle Mr. Croft." He bought his loaf of bread, paid her with a gold coin this time, and touched the brim of his hat. He did not ride out of town. Instead, he turned his horse and walked it directly toward the general store. Lee watched him go, a terrifying hope warring with a lifetime of caution. She had made her choice to stand and fight. Now, Arthur Vance was making his. He was stepping out of the role of quiet protector and into open conflict on her behalf, and the whole town was about to bear witness. Arthur Vance did not enter the general store. He tied his horse to the rail outside and simply waited. He stood on the boardwalk, relaxed and patient, a man with all the time in the world. It was a power play, and everyone knew it. Sooner or later, Jedediah Croft would have to come out. It took less than 10 minutes. Croft emerged, feigning surprise. "Arthur. To what do I owe the honor?" "We need to talk about your new survey, Jedediah," Arthur said, his voice level. "Ah, yes. A simple property dispute. Unfortunate, but the law is the law." Croft tried for a magnanimous tone. "Is it?" Arthur took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Croft could hear, but his intensity was a visible thing. "I spent last night with my copy of the original territorial charter for this town, the one my father helped draft. I also sent a telegraph to my lawyer in Carson City." He's looking at the master deeds filed with the government land office. Croft's smug expression wavered. That's a lot of trouble over a baker. This isn't about the baker, Arthur said, his voice turning cold. This is about you filing a fraudulent survey to drive a person from their livelihood. The original charter measures your property line from the center of Harmony Creek as it flowed in 1862. Your surveyor measured from the current bank. The creek shifted south by 10 feet after the flood of 71. Her oven isn't on your land, Jedediah. Your back wall is on hers. The color drained from Croft's face. He knew Arthur was right. He had gambled on no one having access to the old documents or the will to fight him. He had severely underestimated Arthur Vance. Now, Arthur continued, his voice a low, dangerous murmur, my lawyer seems to think the territorial marshal would be very interested in a case of deliberate land fraud. But I think we can settle this quietly. You will go to the clerk's office and withdraw your claim. You will file a new survey, at your expense, confirming the original property line. And you will deliver a written apology to Miss Ann Lee. If these things are not done by sundown, my next telegraph will be to the U.S. Marshal's office. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned, untied his horse, and swung into the saddle. He rode out of town without a backward glance, leaving Jedediah Croft standing on the boardwalk, utterly defeated. By the time the first snows fell that winter, Harmony Creek was a different place for Ann Lee. The change was not sudden or dramatic, but a gradual thaw. Croft had filed the new survey, his public humiliation complete. The townspeople, who respected strength and despised a bully, shifted their allegiance. Anneli's quiet dignity in the face of Croft's aggression had won her more respect than 1,000 loaves of bread. But the biggest change was the new building at the end of Main Street. Where an old, dilapidated shack had once stood, there was now a handsome clapboard structure with a proper brick chimney and 2 large glass windows. A simple, neatly painted sign hung above the door, Harmony Creek Bakery. Arthur had bought the lot and commissioned the building of it himself. He had overseen every detail, from the laying of the foundation to the installation of a large, state-of-the-art brick oven imported by wagon from Reno. He presented the deed to her on a crisp November morning, the paper tied with a simple blue ribbon. She stood inside the new bakery, the air smelling of fresh-cut pine and plaster. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was more than she had ever dared to dream of. I cannot accept this, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It is too much. It is a business proposition, Arthur said, though his steady grey eyes told a different story. You have a skill this town needs. I have capital. It's a partnership, he gestured to the spacious room. You'll need to hire a girl to help you. Maybe 2, come spring. She looked from the deed in her hand to his face. For months, he had been her customer, then her protector. Now he was offering her a future, a permanent place in the world, rooted in the work of her own hands. He stepped closer, his presence filling the quiet space. "Ann Lee," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I started coming to your table for the bread. It's true. It reminded me of a home I'd lost." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently touch the deed she was holding, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was electric. But I kept coming back for the baker. For her strength. For her quiet grace. For the way she makes this dusty place feel like it's worth saving. He took a breath. This building is just wood and nails. It's empty. It won't be a home until you're in it. He finally met her gaze, his heart in his eyes. I am not asking you to be my baker, Ann Lee. I am asking you to be my wife. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back welled in her eyes, blurring the sight of his earnest face. Her pink prairie dress, a relic of a past life, was carefully stored away in a chest. She now wore a practical apron over a simple, dark blue dress, the attire of a respected town merchant. She had come to this town with nothing but a recipe and a memory. He had come for a loaf of bread, a simple transaction. But in the barren soil of the frontier, they had found something else entirely. In a place built on taking, they had learned the quiet, enduring strength of making something new, together. She looked around the beautiful, empty bakery, and then back at him. She didn't need to say yes. The answer was in her shining eyes. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.